In September of 1903, 9 years after a Maine-born lawyer arrived in a town of 2,000 people with nothing but an unfinished dam and no customers for its power, that same town watched his industrial empire go bankrupt in a single morning. 9 years to build it. 9 years of pulp mills, iron mines, a railway driven north through the bush, a steel plant rolling rails for a national boom. One morning, to lose it when the money simply stopped. The workers went unpaid. The windows of the company office came out first, then the doors. The mayor stood in the street and read the riot act to men who had built the town with their own hands, and nobody listened. Soldiers came from Toronto, riflemen, Highlanders, grenadiers, sent north to hold a company town against the people who worked for it. That was 1903, not the only time. Sault Ste. Marie built that morning into its bones. Boom, brink, rescue, and boom again, decade after decade, for a century. The blast furnaces that rose from one man's gamble ran for more than 100 years. They went cold only recently. The mill is still there. This is the story of a company town that has spent a century learning over and over exactly how close it can come to disappearing without ever quite doing it. Lake Superior does not meet Lake Huron gently. Between them, the St. Mary's River drops roughly 6 meters over a short stretch of white water, known simply as the Rapids, a natural staircase where the largest freshwater lake on Earth empties itself into the next basin down. For anyone moving west by canoe, the rapids were not scenery. They were an obstacle, a place where the water fell fast enough and rough enough that a loaded canoe had no business trying to run it. Everything that moved between Superior and the lower lakes had to stop here first. Unload, start again on foot. The Ojibwe had a name for the place long before any European wrote it down. Ba-wee-tigong, the place at the rapids. For centuries it was a gathering site, a fishing ground, and a portage, the point where canoes came out of the water, were carried overland around the white water on foot, and were put back in on the other side. Fur traders inherited the same geography, and made the same choice the Ojibwe long since had. Every canoe brigade moving furs east or trade goods west had to pass through this exact stretch of river, and there was no way around it that did not involve carrying the load by hand. A choke point on a fur trade highway does not choose its own importance. The rapids simply had it, by accident of geology and for as long as anyone had kept count. 2 towns eventually grew on either bank of the river, both carrying the rapids in their name. Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, sat on the Canadian side. Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, sat on the American side, close enough that a resident of one could see the rooftops of the other, close enough that a shout could carry across the water on a still morning. The international border ran down the middle of the river itself, an abstraction drawn across water that the rapids had been falling through for thousands of years before either government existed to draw it. For the people who lived there, the border was not a distant political fact. It was a fact of daily life, a line you crossed to visit family, to trade, to work, and on either side of it, a town that was hundreds of miles from Toronto, hundreds of miles from Montreal, hundreds of miles from anything a 19th century financier would recognize as a city of consequence. Twin towns, one river, 2 flags, and beyond either one of them, nothing but bush and rock for a very long way. What the Canadian Salt had, before it had almost anything else, was a lock. Construction began in 1889 and the canal opened in 1895, cut through solid rock along the Canadian shore, to let ships bypass the rapids entirely rather than portage around them the way canoes had for centuries. At the moment it opened, it was part of the longest lock system in the world, a piece of engineering built for cargo tonnage that dwarfed the population of the town around it. That town, as late as 1893, counted barely 2,000 people, a settlement organized almost entirely around a canal that had been built for ships passing through, not for an economy generating anything of its own. There was no mill on that riverbank yet, no mine, no railway of any consequence. There was a lock, a scattering of houses, and a current that had been falling in the same place since long before anyone thought to measure it in meters. The Sioux existed in those years as infrastructure first and a town only after that, and the raw materials for something larger were already sitting there, unclaimed, water falling for free at the rapids, day and night, with no dam yet built to catch it, forest running north and west without any visible end, iron somewhere in the hills beyond the tree line, known about but untouched. What the place lacked was not resources. It was capital, and a man willing to bet all of it, at once, on a town of 2,000 people at the edge of the map. That man was about to arrive from Maine. Francis Hector Clergue was born on August 28, 1856, in Bangor, Maine, a lumber town on the Penobscot River that had already seen its own boom come and mostly go by the time he was a young man. He trained as a lawyer. He practiced only briefly. What he turned out to be, over the next 2 decades, was something the law degree had not prepared anyone to predict. A promoter, a man who raised money for enterprises other men had not yet thought to build, and who moved from one such enterprise to the next with a restlessness that never quite settled into a single trade. A promoter, not an engineer, a salesman of futures that did not yet exist, addressed to men who had capital and wanted somewhere new to put it. By most accounts, the ventures behind him by 1894 did not amount to a record of success. Historians who have traced his career before the Sioux describe a pattern that repeats itself with some consistency. Capital raised, a scheme launched, enthusiasm outrunning the underlying economics, and an ending that left investors thinner than they had started. None of it seems to have discouraged him. None of it seems to have taught him caution either. What it left him with, by the time he reached his late 30s, was a talent for finding capital and a talent for describing a distant, unproven opportunity in terms compelling enough that men who had never seen the place would sign the check anyway. In 1894, Clergue arrived at Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, on behalf of a group of Philadelphia capitalists who had sent him north to look at an unfinished piece of infrastructure on the Canadian side of the rapids. The town he found had fewer than 2,000 people in it. What he found waiting for him was a half-built hydroelectric canal and powerhouse, begun by an earlier promoter and abandoned before it ever produced $1 of revenue. A dam, in effect, with no customers. There was falling water and a partly finished structure built to capture it. There was no factory standing ready to buy the power once it existed. No mill, no industry of any kind. Clergue looked at the unfinished works and did not see a failure. He saw an opening no one else had been willing to take. The logic he settled on was simple enough to state coldly, and he stated it that way to the men financing him. There was no market yet for the electricity his canal could generate. So instead of waiting for one to appear, he would build it himself. He would not wait for a customer to arrive at the Sioux on its own. He would construct the customer and then construct the next one to consume whatever the first one produced, each enterprise designed from the outset to feed the appetite of another. Power without a buyer became power with a mill attached to it. A mill without a market for its waste became a mill with a second operation, built specifically to use what the first one threw away. It was not diversification in the ordinary sense. It was a single machine, built one business at a time, in which every new part existed to keep an earlier part running. There was nothing modest about the ambition, and nothing modest about the risk. A man with an unfinished dam and a town of 2,000 people was proposing to build, from nothing, an entire industrial economy designed around his own convenience, and to do it with other people's money, in a place hundreds of miles from the nearest banker who could easily check on how it was going. Clergue did not describe it that way to his investors. He described it as a system, self-financing once the first pieces were in place, each business generating the revenue and the raw material that the next business would need. Whether it could actually work at the scale he was imagining was, in the autumn of 1894, still an open question. By the time the ink was dry on the purchase of the canal, the flywheel he had described was already beginning to turn. What it would produce next did not stay theoretical for long. Once the power was running, Clergue did not stop at one customer. He built a pulp mill on the rapids to buy it, feeding on the forest that ran north and west without any visible end. Then he built the businesses the pulp mill needed and the businesses those businesses needed, until the flywheel he had described to his Philadelphia backers was turning under its own weight. A pulp mill on the rapids, a railway into the bush, a pair of mining districts pulling ore out of hills that had never seen a shaft sunk into them before. Each enterprise existed because an earlier one required it, and each new one, in turn, required something else. North of the Sioux, at Wawa, Clergue's prospectors found iron. The Helen mine went into production and began sending ore back down toward the rapids, the first iron mine of consequence the district had ever operated. It was not the only one for long. 4 iron mines and 5 nickel mines eventually operated under his companies, pulling metal out of country that had been, a decade earlier, marked on the map as simply unclaimed. To move any of it, Clergue needed a railway of his own, since no one else was going to build one into that country on the strength of a promise. The Algoma Central Railway was chartered in 1899 and pushed north through the bush, mile by mile, tying the mines at Wawa and beyond to the mills at the rapids. The catalog past that point reads like an inventory of an entire regional economy assembled by one office. A ferronickel works to process the ore from the nickel mines. A sulfuric acid plant to serve the ferronickel works and the other chemical needs of the district. 3 sawmills to cut the timber the pulp mill did not consume. 4 hydroelectric dams beyond the original powerhouse, built to feed a demand for electricity that had not existed 5 years earlier and now could not be satisfied fast enough. 2 streetcar companies to move workers through a town that had not needed public transit in living memory. A fleet of 11 lake ships to carry ore, pulp, and finished goods across water that had, until recently, carried little more than fur brigades and fishing boats. Whole towns came with it. Mishipikoten grew up around the mining operations on the lake named for it. Wawa grew around the Helen mine. Searchmont grew along the new railway line, a station and a settlement where there had been nothing at all. None of these grew the way towns usually grow, slowly, around a crossroads or a river ford. They existed because a single company had decided, on paper, that ore or timber needed to move through that exact point. The company built the town to make the moving possible. At the center of it, on the rapids near the canal, Clergue ran the whole operation from a stone office building, the headquarters from which every mine, mill, and railway order in the district was issued. It was, in every practical sense, the one building in the Sioux where the entire enterprise actually lived. The town around that office changed at a pace that had no precedent in its own short history. In 1893, the Sioux had counted barely 2,000 people. Within the decade that followed, it was approaching 8,000. Boarding houses going up along streets that had been bush a few years earlier, storefronts opening to sell to workers who had wages to spend for the first time in the town's existence, hotels filling with engineers and prospectors and men looking for a shift at any one of a dozen new operations. It was, by any honest description, a wilderness town living on one man's letterhead. None of it, for all its scale, had been tested yet by hardship. Every mine depended on the railway to move its ore, and every mill depended on the power plant to run its machinery. The railway, in turn, depended on freight from the mines to justify its own cost. And every enterprise in the district depended, in the end, on capital continuing to arrive from outside it, not once, but continuously, year after year, to keep the whole structure standing while it was still too young to support its own weight. It was an empire built on paper and promises, and it had not yet been asked to survive a single year without either. In 1901, Algoma Steel was founded, the last and largest piece of the empire Clergue had assembled from a single unfinished dam 7 years earlier. It was built around Bessemer converters, the same process that had turned Pittsburgh and Hamilton into steel towns a generation before, and it was built for one product above all others: rails. Within a year, the mill was rolling steel rail out of a plant that had not existed when the decade began. Everything else Clergue had built existed, in one sense or another, to make this single mill possible: the pulp mill, the mines at Wawa, the railway pushing north through the bush, the power plant strung along the rapids. The steel works was not simply another business added to the catalog. It was the crown the rest of the empire had been built to support. Rails were not a glamorous product. They were, in 1901, the single most reliably purchased commodity in a country that was expanding faster than it could lay track to keep up with itself. The timing was not an accident, and it did not need to be explained twice to the men financing the mill. Canada, in 1901, was laying railway track at a pace the country had never managed before and would rarely match again. Branch lines pushing into the prairies, main lines being doubled, the whole continental network expanding to keep pace with settlement and grain, and the ambitions of more than one competing railway company. Every mile of that track needed steel rail, and steel rail had to come from somewhere. Algoma Steel proposed to be that somewhere. Contracts followed the plant's opening, the way contracts follow any operation positioned correctly at the start of a boom. Expansion followed the contracts. And behind the expansion, financing every furnace addition and every new siding, came borrowed money. Capital raised the same way Clergue had always raised it. It was financed on the promise of what the mill would earn at full capacity, not on what it had already proven it could do. Set against a map of the country, the scale of what had been built at the Sault was difficult to overstate. This was not a single furnace bolted onto an existing town. It was a fully integrated steel district. Mines, railway, power, and mill, all owned by the same set of companies, all built within the same decade, all standing in one river valley hundreds of miles from any other industrial center of consequence. Proximity to the ore at Wawa, proximity to falling water at the rapids, distance from nearly everything else that Canadian heavy industry usually depended on, major ports, established supply chains, any other city that could absorb a crisis if one arrived. Hamilton, on the shore of Lake Ontario, was by this point Canada's other serious steel town, closer to the country's population and its markets by every measure that mattered. The Sault had chosen a harder version of the same industry, run from farther away, with less margin for anything to go wrong. What made the arrangement work, for the moment, was momentum. Contracts kept arriving as the railway boom kept expanding. Ore kept moving down from Wawa on schedule. The mill kept rolling rail, and the rail kept finding buyers, and the buyers kept paying, at least often enough that the debts taken on to build the plant did not yet look like a problem. It was the kind of arrangement that can run for years on the strength of continued growth alone, so long as growth continues, and so long as the money owed against yesterday's expansion can be serviced by tomorrow's contracts rather than by anything already earned and banked. That arrangement had a limit, even if nobody at the Sault was saying so out loud in 1901 or 1902. Every part of the empire, the mill, the mines, the railway, the town itself, was still running on borrowed time as much as borrowed capital, on the assumption that the next contract, the next shipment, the next round of financing would arrive before the last one ran out. It always had so far. By 1903, quietly and without any single dramatic announcement, that assumption had already stopped being true. The money was running out. By September of 1903, Consolidated Lake Superior, the holding company sitting over Clergue's mines, his mills, his railway, and his steel plant, could no longer meet payroll. It could not, at the same moment, meet its ordinary operating expenses either. The two failures arrived together because in an empire built the way Clergue had built this one, they were never really separate problems. Wages stopped first. Then the whole interlocking arrangement began to fail in sequence. The same way it had been built in sequence, each part depending on the part before it. The mines stopped shipping ore they could not afford to move. The mills stopped rolling steel they could not afford to finish. The railway stopped billing customers it no longer had the staff to serve. An empire assembled to run on continuous motion had, in a matter of days, nothing left to keep it moving. The men who had not been paid did not stay home. On September 28th, they began gathering outside the stone office building on the rapids, the same building from which every order in the district had once been issued, the physical seat of a company that could no longer produce a payroll. What began as a crowd waiting for an explanation did not stay a crowd waiting for long. Windows went first, one after another, until every pane in the building had been broken. Men went in through the openings the broken windows left behind. Offices were entered and stripped of whatever could be carried out. Ledgers, furniture, fixtures, anything that represented, however symbolically, the company that had stopped paying them. The mayor came to the building on September 29th and read the Riot Act aloud, the formal legal instrument by which a crowd is ordered to disperse or be treated as unlawfully assembled. He was ignored. The disturbance continued past the reading of the act the same way it had continued past every earlier point at which it might reasonably have stopped. By the time it had run its course over the 3 days of September the 28th through 30th, 2 policemen and 4 protesters had been injured. No one was killed. The record of those 3 days is, by most accounts, a record of broken glass and looted offices rather than deliberate violence against people, a distinction that did not make the injuries any less real, only more precisely described. Troops arrived from Toronto on September 29th, sent north on the strength of a request that a company town could no longer police itself. 3 regiments made the trip. The the Queen's Own Rifles, the 48th Highlanders, and the 10th Royal Grenadiers, put on trains and moved several hundred miles to stand between a broken payroll and the men it had failed to pay. It was not a foreign army occupying foreign ground. It was the province of Ontario sending its own soldiers to hold its own town, because the alternative to soldiers was a company town with no company left able to run it. The province did more than send troops. It stepped in directly to cover the wages that Consolidated Lake Superior could not. The money came from the government in Toronto, not from the empire that owed it. What had happened, reduced to its simplest arithmetic, was this. An empire of mines, mills, a railway, and a fully integrated steelworks had been assembled in 9 years, starting from an unfinished dam and a town of 2,000 people. It had gone insolvent in considerably less time than that. In the space of a single September, in the collapse of a single payroll, in 3 days of broken windows and soldiers on trains. Francis Clergue's name was on every company in the district, on the letterhead of every order that had built it. Very little cash, it turned out, had ever been sitting behind any of it. What remained to be settled was not whether the empire would survive in its old form. It would not. What remained was who would run what was left of it, and what would happen to the man whose name was on all of it, whose signature had guaranteed none of it. The empire that had collapsed in September of 1903 did not disappear. It was reorganized, the way insolvent industrial empires of that era usually were, creditors, receivers, and a new holding structure assembled to keep the mines and the mill running under different ownership, while the old debts were sorted out behind closed doors. The result was the Lake Superior Corporation, built on the same mines, the same railway, and the same steelworks Clergue had assembled, but no longer answering to him. New directors, new financing arrangements, and new lines of credit replaced the old ones, all of it assembled at a distance from the town whose payroll had just failed. Clergue was pushed out of the company he had built from a single unfinished dam. He kept his name on the district's history. He kept almost nothing else. What became of him afterward fits into a single paragraph, and by most accounts, it deserves no more than that. Clergue spent the remaining decades of his life chasing versions of what he had built at the Sault, in Canada, in the United States, in Russia, and in the Far East, promoting ventures with the same restless energy that had brought him north in 1894. None of them became another Sault. None of them approached the scale of what he had assembled and lost in 9 years on the Rapids. He died in Montreal on January 19, 1939, a man who had once run an empire of mines, mills, and railways from a stone office building, and who had spent the rest of his working life failing to build a second one. The mill did not die with him. It did not stop rolling rail. It did not stop shipping steel to a country that kept needing more of it. Through the railway booms that followed 1903, Algoma Steel kept producing, kept filling contracts, kept operating as the industrial anchor of a district that had outlived the man who built it. When war orders arrived between 1914 and 1918, the mill filled those too, its furnaces running for a market that had, for those 4 years, an almost unlimited appetite for steel. What the mill could not shake, through all of it, was the condition it had inherited from its founding, a corporation still limping between creditors in London and creditors in New York, refinanced and reorganized more than once, solvent in the narrow sense that it kept operating, never solvent in the sense that anyone could call its finances settled. That condition held for 3 decades. The town around the mill, meanwhile, kept growing, largely indifferent to the state of the corporate paperwork above it. Immigrant labor filled the mines, the mill, and the works that fed them. Italian neighborhoods, Finnish neighborhoods, Ukrainian neighborhoods, each one taking shape around the same employer the way the earlier boarding houses had taken shape around Clergue's original catalog of enterprises. The Sault's identity hardened into something simpler than it had been in Clergue's day, when the empire was still new and its scale still surprising. By the 1910s and 20s, there was no longer much room for surprise in it. You worked at Algoma, or you worked for someone who supplied Algoma, or you ran a business that served the men who did either of those things. There was, in practical terms, very little else the town was for. A man might arrive from Italy, from Finland, from a village in Ukraine, and find within a few years that his address, his neighbors, and his son's likely future occupation had all been arranged for him by the same employer. He had never quite chosen any of it. By the early 1930s, that arrangement was under strain again. The corporation's finances, never fully resolved since 1903, had grown thinner through years of refinancing and the onset of a worldwide depression that was hitting steel demand everywhere at once. Algoma Steel was, once more, a company that needed rescuing rather than merely running. The rescue, when it came, arrived from London finance and a small town on the New Brunswick coast, from a man who had made his fortune a very long way from the Sault, and who was about to make the mill, for the next 2 decades, into something very close to a personal estate. Sir James Hammett Dunn was born in Bathurst, New Brunswick, a small port town on the Acadian coast, and he made his fortune a long way from it. In London, in the world of corporate finance, restructuring companies and raising capital for industries he did not build and did not run, only financed and rearranged. He was not an engineer. He was not, in any hands-on sense, an industrialist at all. What he understood, better than most men of his era, was the machinery of ownership itself, how a failing company's debts could be reorganized, how control could be consolidated into a single set of hands, how a bankrupt enterprise could be made solvent again on paper long before it was made solvent in fact. By the 1930s, he was one of the more formidable financiers of his generation, the kind of man other men's failing companies were handed to when nothing gentler had worked. Algoma Steel, still limping between London and New York creditors 3 decades after Clergue's collapse, was exactly the sort of company that found its way to him. In 1935, Dunn took control of bankrupt Algoma through a financial reorganization, installing himself as both president and chairman, the 2 roles that mattered, held by the same man, with no meaningful check between them. He did not come to the Sault to run day-to-day operations from the mill floor. He ran it from a distance, the way he had run every other reorganization of his career, through instructions, through appointments, through the leverage that comes from controlling both the capital and the boardroom at once. What changed at Algoma after 1935 was not the geography of the mill, it was who answered to whom. By most accounts, Dunn ran Algoma for the next 2 decades the way a man runs a personal estate, rather than the way a corporation is usually run. Decisions made by one man's preference, appointments made on one man's judgment. The company's direction set less by committee than by whatever Dunn himself had decided it should be. Historians who have written about his tenure describe a level of personal control over the company that was unusual even by the standards of mid-century Canadian industry, where individual chairmen still carried outsized authority. It was not the interlocking, over-leveraged empire Clergue had built. It was something narrower and, in its own way, more stable. One man's judgment applied consistently for a very long time. That stability was tested almost immediately. War arrived again in 1939, and with it came government orders for steel on a scale the mill had not filled since the last war a generation earlier. Algoma modernized under the pressure of wartime demand. New capacity, new equipment, production schedules built around a national need rather than a commercial one. For the 6 years of the Second World War, the mill functioned less as a private company chasing contracts than as a national asset that happened to be privately owned. Its output measured against the country's war requirements rather than against ordinary peacetime demand. Dunn's control over the company did not loosen during those years. If anything, it tightened, as government orders flowed through the same narrow channel of decision-making that had governed everything else at Algoma since 1935. The war ended in 1945, and Dunn kept running the company much as he had before it, through 11 more years of post-war expansion, new investment, new capacity, the mill growing to meet a Canadian economy that was building houses, cars, and appliances at a pace it had never managed before the war. The immigrant neighborhoods that had grown up around the mill in Clergue's day, and hardened into permanence in the receivership years, were still there, still filling the same shifts, still organized around the same employer. 2 decades under one man's judgment had not changed that arrangement. It had, if anything, made it more permanent than before. He died in 1956, still chairman, still president. The company still organized almost entirely around his judgment after 21 years of it. What came after his death was not decline. It was, by most measures, the best the mill would ever have it. Picture Queen Street on a Friday evening, sometime in the 1960s. It is payday at the mill, and the street knows it before the first paycheck is cashed. The hotels are filling early. The beer parlors are loud by 6 o'clock. The car lots keep their lights burning later than usual, because Friday is when a man with overtime in his pocket decides whether this is the month he trades up. Storefronts do a week's business in a single evening. The street smells of exhaust, of beer, of the mill itself on the wind off the rapids. Nobody needed to be told what powered it. The whole town was, in the most literal sense, spending the mill's money. By the height of the post-war boom, Algoma Steel employed more than 10,000 people directly. A workforce large enough that its shift changes functioned as a kind of civic clock the rest of the town set itself by. 3 shifts, turning over around the same hours every day, meant Queen Street had its own rush hours that had nothing to do with any office downtown. The plant rolled plate steel, strip steel, and structural steel, feeding shipbuilders, manufacturers, and construction firms across the country, steel that went into ships on both coasts, into buildings in cities the mill's own workers would likely never see. In the hierarchy of Canadian steelmakers, Algoma sat second only to Hamilton, the country's other serious steel city, half a continent away on the shore of Lake Ontario, closer to the population centers and the ports. The Sault was smaller than its southern counterpart and always would be, but it was not a distant second. It was a full-scale steel town in its own right, running at a pace that matched or beat plants twice its size and access to markets. Canada, in effect, had 2 steel cities. One of them sat where everything else was. The other sat where the ore and the water were, half a country away, and had built an entire economy around the difference. What that success amounted to, stated without any of the civic pride the town itself would have attached to it, was a monoculture. One employer set the town's payroll. One employer's fortunes decided what the car dealerships on Queen Street could expect to sell in a given year. One price, the price of steel, set in markets the town itself had no influence over, moved through every part of local life that looked on its surface, unconnected to a blast furnace. Minor hockey registration numbers rose and fell with overtime hours at the mill. The volume of business at the hotels on a Friday night rose and fell with the size of that week's paychecks. A downturn in steel prices, whenever one eventually arrived, would not simply cost the mill money. It would cost the town its rhythm, because the town and the mill had, by this point, stopped being 2 separate things that happened to sit near each other. There was no second employer of any real size to absorb a slow year. There was no other industry in the district large enough to matter if this one faltered. There was only the mill, and everything else the mill had made possible. This was the arrangement's strength for as long as steel prices held. It was also, without anyone in the Sault needing to say so out loud, the exact shape of its vulnerability. A one-employer town does not merely depend on that employer. It becomes, in every measurable sense, an extension of it. Its wages, its holidays, its bad years and good years absorb directly into a household budget in a way that a more diversified city never quite experiences. The vulnerability was not a flaw hidden somewhere inside the success. It was the same fact, looked at from the other direction. For most of the 1950s and 1960s, nobody on Queen Street had much reason to look at it from the other direction. The mill was hiring. The paychecks were good. The hotels and the car lots and the beer parlors had no complaints about the arrangement, and neither did the town that lived on their receipts. And then, in the 1970s, the price of steel stopped behaving the way it always had. The 1970s had ended the illusion that Algoma's boom was permanent, and the 1980s made the correction concrete. Imports of foreign steel, cheaper than anything a Canadian mill could produce, began taking market share that Algoma had once treated as its own by default. Global overcapacity in steelmaking meant too many mills chasing too few contracts, and a recession in the early part of the decade cut demand from the shipbuilders, manufacturers, and construction firms that had kept the plant's furnaces running through the long boom. Imports were not unique to the Sault. Overcapacity was not unique to the Sault. Recession was not unique to the Sault. Every steel town in North America was absorbing some version of the same 3 pressures at the same time. What was unique to the Sault was how much of the town's own economy sat directly downstream of a single plant, absorbing all 3 at once with nothing else nearby, large enough to soften the impact. In 1988, DeFasco, the Hamilton-based steelmaker, took a controlling stake in Algoma, a move that briefly looked like exactly the kind of external rescue the company had needed twice before. It did not hold. By 1991, DeFosco had walked away from the position, writing off its investment rather than continuing to fund a mill whose losses showed no sign of stabilizing. The workforce that had once numbered more than 10,000 had fallen to somewhere around 6,000, and it was still falling. The mill that had built the town's identity around one payroll was now shrinking that payroll year over year, with no clear floor in sight. What came next was the sharpest test the company had faced since 1903. In 1990 and 1991, Algoma sought protection from its creditors, the formal legal process by which an insolvent company buys itself time to reorganize instead of simply being liquidated. Analysts studying the company's position at the time did not describe the stakes gently. A full closure of the mill, they warned, would cost the region something in the range of 11,000 jobs once every direct and indirect position was counted. In a city of roughly 80,000 people, that was not a company in trouble. That was a city's entire employment base sitting on the edge of a single balance sheet, with the arithmetic pointing, for the first time since the receivership years, toward zero rather than toward recovery. 11,000 jobs in a city of 80,000 people meant that something close to every household in the Sioux had some direct stake in whether the mill survived the winter. The rescue that followed did not come from a financier in London or a holding company assembled by distant creditors. It came from the workers themselves, negotiated through the province. On February 28, 1992, Premier Bob Rae announced the terms of a deal at Queen's Park in Toronto. The employees of Algoma Steel would trade wage concessions for ownership of the company, backed by provincial loan guarantees that made the arrangement possible in the first place. The agreement took effect on June 1, 1992. The people who had spent decades working shifts timed to somebody else's payroll were, for the first time in the mill's history, the ones the payroll ultimately answered to. It was not the first time the government in Toronto had stepped in to keep the mill's workforce from losing everything at once. It had done something of the kind 90 years earlier, in 1903, when the province sent money to cover payroll after Clergue's empire collapsed. The specifics were different: soldiers and a broken payroll then, loan guarantees and a Queen's Park announcement now. But the underlying fact was the same fact, arriving on a 90-year delay. A company town, unable to save itself, saved from outside by the province it belonged to. Nobody in the Sioux, watching Bob Rae's announcement in the winter of 1992, described it as the last time the mill would need rescuing. Most of the town, by most accounts, simply hoped it was. 9 decades earlier, 9 years had built the empire, and one morning had ended it. This time, it had taken most of a decade of decline, and a deal negotiated in a legislature hundreds of miles away to buy the mill another chance. The employee ownership deal of 1992 bought Algoma Steel time, not permanence. By April of 2001, the company was back in creditor protection, its workforce down to somewhere around 4,000 people, a fraction of the more than 10,000 who had once worked there at the height of the post-war boom, and well below even the reduced numbers of the DeFosco years. The mill was still running. It was simply running smaller, again, under the same legal process the company had already used twice before to buy itself another chance. Each round of creditor protection had followed the same basic pattern since 1903. The plant kept its furnaces lit. The ownership structure got rebuilt around new terms, and the town outside the gates absorbed whatever the new terms cost it. In September of 2002, Dennis Turcotte took over as chief executive. Turcotte was a Sioux-raised engineer, a local product running the company that had shaped the town he grew up in, and over the following years, he steered Algoma out of creditor protection and into a period of genuine operating strength. By 2006, Canadian Business, a national business magazine, named him the country's top chief executive. Industry rankings from the period describe Algoma, under his leadership, as among the most efficient steel mills anywhere in the world. A striking description for a plant that had been in and out of insolvency for most of a century, run from a river valley hundreds of miles from any comparable industrial center. For a few years in the middle of the decade, the company that had spent 100 years lurching between rescue and collapse was, by the standard measures the industry used to judge itself, one of the better-run steel operations on the continent. The efficiency made the company attractive, and in 2007, that attractiveness was tested directly. Essar Global, a steel and energy conglomerate based in Mumbai, bought Algoma at $56 a share, a deal valued at approximately $1.85 billion. The company was renamed Essar Steel Algoma. A mill that had once been the personal project of a Bangor lawyer, then a British financier's estate, then the property of the men who worked its furnaces, became, in 2007, a single-line item in the accounts of a global industrial conglomerate headquartered on the other side of the planet. That arrangement did not hold either. In November of 2015, Algoma entered creditor protection for a third time. Driven by a collapse in global steel prices and a dispute with a supplier the mill depended on to keep operating. The proceedings that followed stretched across the wider Essar Group for roughly 7 years, tangled in litigation involving companies and creditors far beyond the sue itself, a legal process measured in years rather than months. In 2018, the creditors emerged as the new owners. The Essar name came off the mill. The name that went back up was the one the company had carried since 1901, Algoma Steel. Crisis, rescue, brief triumph, then crisis again. 3 trips through creditor protection in 25 years, 1990, 2001, and 2015, each one following the same underlying shape. A company built on debt and momentum, running well until the momentum stalled, rescued from outside, and running well again until the next stall arrived. In 2021, Algoma went public once more, listed on both the Toronto Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. The federal government committed approximately $420 million toward converting the mill to electric arc steelmaking. It was a bet that the plant's next chapter could be built around something other than the blast furnace process it had used since 1901. Whether that bet would pay off was still, in the years that followed, an open question. One tangled up with the price of steel on world markets, with trade politics the company did not control, and with furnaces that had been running for more than a century and were approaching decisions that could not be deferred much longer. The pattern of the last quarter century had been crisis, rescue, and a run of good years, followed eventually by crisis again. Nothing about the next chapter of that pattern had been settled yet. In July of 2025, Algoma Steel brought its first electric arc furnace online, the centerpiece of the conversion the federal government had helped finance 4 years earlier. Steel could now be made at the Sault without a blast furnace at all. Scrap and electricity in place of coke and iron ore, a different chemistry for a process that had defined the plant since 1901. It was the largest change to how steel was actually made at the Sault since Clergue's Bessemer converters first went into service. In January of 2026, blast furnace number 7 and the coke ovens that fed it went cold. They will not be relit. It was the end of blast furnace iron making at the Sault after more than a century. The same basic process, the same category of fire that had rolled the district's first rails within a year of the mill's founding, finally going dark in the plant that had run it longest. Across those same months, American tariffs on steel doubled to 50%. The company reported a loss approaching $1 billion. Layoffs moved through the mill and through the city again, 123 years after the first time a payroll at this address had failed to hold. Neither fact cancels the other out, and neither one needs to be softened to make room for it. Both belong in the record side by side, the cleanest mill Algoma has ever operated, and one of the hardest years it has ever had. The rapids are still there. The St. Mary's River still drops roughly 6 meters between Superior and Huron, the same water that Bawitgong was named for, running now past the Twin Cities the way it ran past the fur brigades that once had to carry their canoes around it. The 1895 Canal, once part of the longest lock system in the world, is a National Historic Site. Tour boats pass through it in summer, where fleets of freighters and ore carriers once queued for their turn at the gates, moving at a fraction of the tonnage the lock was built to carry, carrying passengers now instead of pulp and ore. The stone office building on the rapids, the one from which Clergue ran an empire of mines and mills and a railway into the bush, is the Algoma Conservatory of Music now. Students practice scales in the rooms where, on 3 days in September of 1903, every window in the building was broken by men who had not been paid. The building does not advertise what happened inside it. It simply stands, repaired long ago, holding a use its builder never imagined for it. The Algoma Central Railway still runs north out of the Sault, the same line chartered in 1899 to move ore down from Wawa. It carries excursion trains up the Agawa Canyon now, tourists riding in autumn, to look at the color changing on hills that once supplied iron and nickel to a mill that no longer needs as much of either as it used to. The freight the line was built to carry has not disappeared entirely. It has simply become a smaller fraction of what the railway does. The rapids did not fall for 9 years and then stop. They have been falling at roughly the same rate for longer than any company that has ever tried to harness them. Francis Clergue built an empire against that water in 9 years and lost it in a morning. James Dunn ran it like an estate for 2 decades. The workers bought it in 1992. SR bought it in 2007. Creditors took it back in 2018. Through every one of those changes of hands, the water kept moving at the same 6-meter drop it has always managed, indifferent to who currently held the deed to the town beside it. The rapids were here first. They will be here after the last furnace, whichever one turns out to be the last. 6 meters, superior to Huron, falling the same way it fell before anyone thought to build a lock, a mill, or a town beside it. It is still falling now.